In this class, mostly I want to talk about the article, Science, the Media, and the Interpretations of Upper Paleolithic Figurines, and put that together with the Lavin and Schultz stuff, as well as talk about subsistence, and so the different terms that archaeologists have used to describe human societies, bands and tribes and chiefdoms. Mostly I want to do that. But part of what I think we need to do before we do that is to do a little bit of cleanup from the last class. When we were talking about archaeology, we were getting pretty deep into archaeological methods and dating techniques and those kinds of things. And I want to zoom out a little bit to the kind of overview of the scope of archaeology and the responsibility of archaeology. So I'm going to start out with this quote from the beginning of Lavin and Schultz's chapter 6, which you've already seen because we talked about it as part of, what will happen if all these sophisticated techniques are going along and these sophisticated theories, but there's nothing left to study because it's all been plundered or looted. What is going to happen then? And so some archaeologists have concluded that archaeology, one of the main points of it is not simply the study of the past and the interpretation of it, but the stewardship of the remains of the human past, the care of that past. And I'd like to take that a little bit further as they do toward the middle and end of the chapter to talk about what archaeology means in today's world. That in some ways it has to be more than simply a science or a study of the past. It has to speak to the people of today and the concerns that people have about what is going on in their own lives. And so a little later on in this chapter, Lavin and Schultz addressed the issue that we need to understand archaeology with reference to the people who are actually often living in these sites and these areas. And too often, archaeologists and others kind of parachute in from a place of privilege. They dig things up, they take them away, they put them in museums, they use the findings to talk about different theories that they have, but they don't really relate to the people who are trying to make sense of their own identity in the places where they are. And so we have to understand archaeology in reference to the people who are actually living in these areas and living with these sites and artifacts and what kind of identity they want to have and what they think their relationship is to the past. In North American archaeology, one of the biggest points of contention or conflict has been the North American Graves and Protection Rights Act. I think I got that right, which is basically a law that was passed that specified that museums and archaeologists needed to go through their collection and to, in fact, repatriate remains that had been taken, especially from Native American sites, because sites and graves and sacred places were simply raided at various points, and stuff was put into museums and collected without any permission of the actual inhabitants. And so this has caused a lot of controversies. It hasn't always been seen as a good thing by many professional archaeologists who believe that in some ways they should have priority to the scientific study of human origins, for example. But the perspective of Lavin and Schultz, and it's one that I share, and the archaeologists they are quoting here, is that by doing this kind of collaboration with native peoples and negotiating where things should be dug and what should be done with them and what kind of questions we should ask, that leads us to have better archaeology in general. This goes on when they talk about a number of what they call collaborative approaches to archaeology, where you're not just working with the remains, you're actually talking to the people who are there and talking to them as if they are important in your study. And so in some ways, this is an extension of what we called ethnoarchaeology, or talking to people about the artifacts and places where they live. But it's also more geared toward, you might say, trying to figure out how peoples in the past are related to those kinds of issues in the present. And so I just wanted to highlight a number of different archaeologists that Lavin and Schultz also highlight. Janet Spector's work on historical archaeology in the United States. So we call historical archaeology that archaeology that is done when there are written records as well, and how she collaborated with people in her field site to address some of these issues and the representation where they were. Lavin and Schultz used a lot of, I mentioned in the last class, Renfrew and Bahn's work on archaeological methods, but there's also a good section here where Renfrew and Bahn talk about their work in Australia with Aboriginal peoples, where they're doing archaeology, but they're also speaking to issues of contemporary identity there. And there's a good box on page 195, which talks about archaeology as a tool of civic engagement, which again sums up this idea that it's important to understand that when you go in to do archaeology, you are also engaging with the residents, you're engaging with people who are around you, you have to talk to people in schools. We actually do, I think, a pretty good job with this when we do our environmental Pine Lake Field School in archaeology. They always invite the schools in to talk about the meaning of the artifacts. So it's a way of engaging with the people around you as well. At the very end of this chapter, Lavin and Schultz talk about cosmopolitan archaeologies, which is a term I've always disliked because it kind of makes it sound like they're having they're reading that magazine that you find in the grocery stores. But what they mean by cosmopolitan archaeologies are archaeologies in which you have to negotiate the complexities of the situation. And so they end this chapter by saying you have to collaborate, you have to negotiate with people, and you don't always know how that's going to end. There might be people who have more than one perspective in the group where you are. So like I said, I wanted to do this as a kind of supplement to some of the methods and scope of archaeology before we get into a kind of more, we might say, chronological approach to what we're going to be dealing with in terms of subsistence in the human past and some of these figurine issues. So that's the part of the how do we talk about the human past chapter. As I said, most of this class I want to spend on kind of where we were at the end of the biological evolution anthropology section, and leading in to talk about subsistence strategies. We're going to be speaking on Thursday about the domestication of plants and animals. But this class is all about what was happening, you might say, between the time that humans spread out all over the world and the time that they began to domesticate plants and animals. So this is a map that we saw back at the end of our biological anthropology unit, in which Homo sapiens spread all over the habitable world. They're everywhere. And they're everywhere because they're everywhere because they are able to use learned behavior or culture in order to adapt to different climates. So they're not biologically adapting necessarily as much as they are culturally adapting and migrating into all these areas. They're using flexible styles of subsistence, and they're spreading out using and adapting a pattern which emerged, which we call hunting and gathering. And so this is the pattern it's a very different pattern in different climates and different areas, obviously, but it's the pattern that enables Homo sapiens, human beings, to spread out all over the world. Now, these societies are always in interaction with each other. And we've talked about how they did not none of these societies became isolated enough that they split off and became a separate species or even a separate subspecies. They were always in interaction and trading all across this range. There was plenty of gene flow across these areas. And what we see when we look at these groups geographically is we see gradual or clinal variation between them because they're in contact with each other. But we have human beings all over the world at about 15,000 years ago. Now, it is at this time that there's these figurines, or these figurines come basically from this time. Some of the most famous examples were found in France, but they range across an area of what we consider to be the Old World or Eurasia, from France all the way out to Siberia, dating from approximately 40,000 years ago to about 9,000 years ago, but all before we have any substantial domestication of plants and animals. And so when these figurines are found, and there's, as Nowell Chang put it, there's over 200 of them that have been found, they are often put into museums and sort of cleaned up and then put onto pedestals. And sometimes people begin art history classes by looking at some of these figurines. And what seems to happen a lot of times is when these figurines were first found, and whenever somebody finds a new one, they look at them, or people look at them, and look at the proportions and the bodily proportions, and they start thinking about porn. It's like, I don't know what happens, but that's just what happens to people. And there's a headline, there's something in the newspaper. They start thinking this must be, what these guys were doing back in the day. There they are, representations of the female body, which were aimed at men. And so this is, like I said, these are cleaned up figurines that then they put into the art history museums and those kinds of places, but they've often been framed as being having something to do with male erotic desire. And so I want to first talk about why it is that when we dig up things from this period of history, we jump into these ideas about the role of men and the role and where people were in terms of their, what you might call their social understanding. And so what I want to first describe to you is a story of how we used to think about human society and the progression of history. And it's a story that has a technical label from Lewis Henry Morgan called Unilineal cultural evolutionism. And that's on page 181 of Lavin and Schultz. Now, Lewis Henry Morgan was an anthropologist in North America. And what his label did and his studies did was kind of galvanize an idea that is still with us today. We may not know that we have this idea, but it's deeply embedded in our popular culture, in our cartoons, in our ideas about how the world came to be the way it is. And so we may not call it unilineal cultural evolutionism. That's kind of a technical term for a stereotype that people had about society. And the stereotype goes something like this. And I'm going to be simplifying here. The stereotype is that when man, and this is all very gendered, that man comes out as man the hunter. And so the first thing that happens is that people are roaming around in these bands, what Lavin and Schultz and archaeologists call bands of small groups of people, and they're hunting wild animals to survive. And that inevitably leads up to that somehow from the hunting stage, they start lassoing and taming those animals and corralling them until we get man the herder. And so this is man who's going along and riding animals and being able to follow along with the animals. And we often see that as equivalent to a stage in which there are tribes. So we've gone up to a larger group, which we call tribes instead of bands. And then from there, maybe because the animals are in their dung and they're all more settled down, we see this idea that then man begins to farm, begins to civilize himself, and settles down into something that is even bigger that we sometimes call chiefdoms. And there's a chief and there's a political organization. It's because man has become a farmer. And then finally, we have civilized man, or as I like to say sometimes, man the scientist, who is organized and does PowerPoints and has a state society. And so this is a kind of progression of civilization from the primitive state of man the hunter through the barbaric state of tribes and chiefdoms up to the civilized state of, oh, they would probably say about maybe give or take 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, depending on who you ask, or maybe 100 years ago. So we've seen this a little bit before in terms of when we're talking about race and ethnocentrism. It's actually it has racist overtones. But today, and in this part of class, we're going to talk mostly about the gendered overtones of this progression. Basically, at the end of this unit, I want you to be able to say that this is a totally incorrect way of thinking about the world. But to get there, we need to examine how it became so deeply ingrained in us to believe that this is the way the world worked. In this class, we're going to be focusing on this one stage of human history, the band organization, the stage that led to Homo sapiens spreading out all over the world, and which has been typified as the man the hunter stage. So we're going to focus in on that and try to figure out what was going on during this stage. Should we call it man the hunter at all? Now, as I was mentioning, Levin and Schultz talk about this in terms of what they call subsistence strategies. And there is a historical emergence of subsistence strategies in the sense that different societies and different ways of exploiting the environment emerged historically at different periods. But it doesn't look exactly like, or it doesn't look like what we assume in terms of the man the hunter progression. So back in the day, sort of in the early stages, there was a stage that I will call the first stage of hunting and gathering. Some people believe that in this early stage, Homo sapiens were more scavenging in the terms of trying to basically scrape the meat and bones of things that had been killed by the great African predators. And so they weren't so much hunting as much as they were scavenging through the remains of other kills. Some people say that didn't happen, that Homo sapiens were always able, through endurance walking and other forms, to do at least some rudimentary hunting and gathering as when we became bipedal creatures. So I'll just say that it's either of those, but it's not a sophisticated hunting and gathering system. The more sophisticated hunting and gathering system I'll call hunting and gathering 2, which is the system that enabled the hunters and gatherers to spread throughout the world and was adapted in various ways in various climates. And as we'll see, has some pretty sophisticated technological achievements as well. After that, and this is what we'll be talking about on Thursday, some societies began to cultivate at first domesticated plants. And this is something we call horticulture, or you might think of it as small-scale gardening. After that, some societies became more intensively dependent on their plants and upon their animals. And we call this agriculture, which is an intensification. And so you become very dependent. It's not just gardening, because you have whole classes of people, farmers, that are dedicated to producing for other people. Interestingly, what we know of as herding or herding animals emerges historically after agriculture. That is to say, it's not something that emerges straight out of the hunting and gathering pattern. We know that herding societies emerge after agriculture, and I've drawn the arrow in both ways because they only work in interaction and trade with agricultural societies. So this is a kind of overview of the historical emergence of these societies. Now, as Levin and Schultz say, we still, or archaeologists still do at times use these terms, these categories of bands, mainly to describe hunters and gatherers, tribes, mainly to describe some of the horticulture and some of the herders, chiefdoms, mainly to describe some horticultural societies and some of the larger horticultural societies and some of the agricultural societies, and then states, which we'll talk about next week, which is a government level or centralized organization that almost always depends upon agriculture. So as a descriptive, archaeologists do still use these terms, but there's two caveats or ways in which we want to be careful of these terms. For one, today we reject what Lavin and Schultz refer to as lockstep determinism, that one stage is inevitably going to turn into the next. We see, in fact, that different societies sometimes develop horticulture and keep being horticulturalists. They don't become more intensive agriculturalists, or they may develop agriculture and then they may start hunting and gathering again. So different societies move in and out of these phases. There's not a kind of inevitable progression in human history. And so Levin and Schultz want us to be able to use these categories, but they see them as points on a continuum. As I say, people and groups can go back and forth, and there's not these kind of hard and clear definitional lines between one and another. Now, in the quiz, I did give credit to those of you who said contemporary anthropologists don't want to use these terms at all, because I kind of agree with that as well. I mean, we do sometimes use these terms as a shorthand. So, but the correct answer to that, and you get an extra point if you got the correct answer was that you can use these terms as long as you recognize that they're more like points on a continuum. They're not lockstep determinism. But I do agree that in some ways we have to be very careful when we use some of these terms, especially the term tribe, because tribe has this whole emotional connotation. People really love to use the word tribe everywhere that it doesn't belong. So we always have to be careful when we say the word tribe, because it blows up in people's faces about how our stereotypes about people who live in tribes. As long as we're aware that these are kind of descriptive terms and don't get too attached to them, we can be okay with that. As I said, in today's class, we are focusing in on the sophisticated hunting and gathering societies that developed and were the ways in which human beings were able to spread out all over the world before any plants or animals were domesticated. So, in the last 50 years, anthropologists have done a huge reassessment of the idea of man the hunter. And perhaps the first thing that people figured out was how important it was that women were gathering calories or gathering roots and tubers and berries and all those things. In many of these groups, and obviously this will depend on your climate and whether you're up in the icy north or in Australia or in South America, but in many of these groups, women and gathering provide about 70% of the calories that you see of the daily intake. So in this sense, hunting is kind of a high status, occasionally good activity, but it doesn't really contribute the bulk of the food or the bulk of the calories that people have in their daily life. The other thing we figured out is that not all men are out there hunting. Some of them might be gathering as well, or they might be gathering while they're hunting, because if you aren't successful in your hunt, you probably should bring something back along the way, or at least maybe eat some berries. We've also figured out that women there used to be this huge argument that women were biologically incapable of hunting, which turns out to be untrue. Women can hunt. They may not do it the way that we sometimes think about hunting. But there's various ways that women are contributing to, or actually even doing, the hunting. Sometimes when we think about hunting, we think about big game animals only, but a lot of hunting is small game animals, and sometimes that's done with nets, with trapping or snares, being able to surround animals and drive them off a cliff or something like that. And this is something that can be a collective activity, and certainly women can contribute to this. As I mentioned before, there are some people, I think I showed you the cover of that book that talked about Man the Hunted, which is taking a direct aim at the idea that that man was going off hunting all the time. That book talks about how, in fact, perhaps some of the key aspects of human evolution were formed because people were basically prey rather than being hunting all the time. Others have talked about how probably they weren't doing so much big game hunting, but as I mentioned, doing scavenging. Again, these are both debatable ideas. Some people get more into them than others. But in any case, the idea that the primary motor of the society was a man the hunter has been reassessed or re-examined. So we don't actually use hunting societies anymore, in fact, because they basically don't exist. Any society that we see is going to combine hunters and gatherers. And like I said, in the last 50 years, or at least since the 60s, maybe I should say the last 60 years, there's been a very huge rethinking of our stereotypes about people who live in hunting and gathering societies. One of the things that we know is that there isn't just one hunting and gathering pattern. So in different habitats in the north, the south, the tropics, the mountains, these are different habits and techniques. And so it's a complicated, or it's a complex way to live. But the interesting thing is that it's been successful all around the habitable world. It's been the way that, as I said, that Homo sapiens were able to spread out and live in all these areas. We've also discovered that a lot of hunting and gathering societies need to have a pretty complex toolkit. If you're hunting marine animals, for example, you need a pretty sophisticated toolkit. And it's hard to gauge exactly what makes a toolkit complex or not, but some people would say that by certain measures, the stuff that it takes to be a successful hunter-gatherer is actually more complicated than some of the early agricultural implements, which were as simple as a digging stick. They weren't very they didn't need to be very technologically complex. The other thing that we've learned about hunters and gatherers is we used to think that they were simply kind of pursuing wild nature or not really changing their environment. So we used to divide between what we called food collectors and food producers. We now know that hunters and gatherers are sophisticated environmental managers. They will often use things like fire to burn away some of the landscape, and so to encourage the growth of the kinds of plants and animals that are favored to them. This was actually especially true in North America. The Europeans, when they arrived here, were amazed at how the people that we would now call Native Americans used fire in order to clear vast parts of the forest, and that would encourage the growth of deer and other animals that were important for their diet. So this is something that we've come to understand in part sometimes because when hunter-gatherers have been removed from an environment, it often can go into decay or mismanagement, and then suddenly people realize that they were doing something important in actively managing the environment. We've also, as we've talked about, or as Lavin and Schultz talked about, realized the importance of women in all of these groups. And so this is where feminist archaeology comes in, is sort of going back into the historical record and looking at those areas in which the contributions of women have been overlooked. And this is an extremely important rethinking of the archaeological process, which has been hugely important in our understanding of the past. In more recent years, people have started to question our own ideas that come from our society, that all societies are organized as male-female, and that this gender binary goes way back into ancient history. And so this is an insight from what we might call a more recent thing, which is gender archaeology, which looks at whether or not, in fact, gender is necessarily one of the main categories of distinction in the artifacts, and doesn't assume that everything is simply organized on a male-female binary. Again, on the quiz, I actually see both feminist archaeology and gender archaeology as important. And so the correct answer to that question was that feminist archaeology is about recapturing and realizing why women's contribution has been written out of the record. But I did give credit to the idea that gender archaeology is a more recent and perhaps subsumes the idea of feminist archaeology. I personally think you need both, and you shouldn't be afraid of that feminist word, but I understand, I think, where people were coming from when they were talking about gender archaeology as being kind of more recent and encompassing of the previous feminist archaeology. I think I want to take I think that will be that last part will be the end of part 1 of the class.